Okay, I said last time that we would start today with a recap of Hume's ethics to allow opportunity for discussion, feedback. And it seems to me that this is an appropriate way in any case of introducing the moral sense philosophers of the 18th century that we've made reference to along the way. So let me start with the recap of Hume's ethics, where you recall the overall question is whether morality is based in reason or sentiment, feeling, reason or sentiment. And plainly, the option of it being based in reason is that of John Locke and the Cambridge Platonists, with their innate knowledge, of course. As far as Hume is concerned, the question is about what do we mean by reason. It has to do with relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas, yes, reason can help you to define ethical terms and to interrelate ethical concepts. That's all. And in terms of matters of fact, it can help with empirical anticipations, predictions of consequences. Hence his emphasis on a principle of utility. But when he gets that far, the point is that matters of fact can tell you what is, as a matter of fact, the situation that you're facing. What is likely to eventuate if you take certain actions. But how do you get from the is to the ought? And it's to David Hume's credit that in the history of ethics, he's the first one to really point up that question. The is-ought question, as we call it. Previously, it's been assumed that there are certain objective, intellectually accessible moral truths which sort of carry an ought of their own, or else represent the ought that God has laid on them, if the truths are about God's commands, God's will. But Hume, without that religious basis for an ethic, is committed as an empiricist to deriving ethical obligation from nothing more than the empirical. You see? How do you get an ought from an is? And this is the problem that haunts empirically oriented ethical theory from Hume's day until, well past mid-20th century. We'll be coming back to it again and again. It seems to me that the problem is related to the fact that the empiricism which Hume is talking about is essentially the method of empirical science. He sees it as Newton's method. So the problem is that the 18th century conception of scientific method is that scientific thinking, scientific method is value neutral, you see. Or if you like, that the world which science is investigating, the Newtonian universe, is a value-free world, a world of value-free facts. And indeed, if all that you have is, in the Newtonian picture, particles of matter and blind forces at work, then there is no inherent purpose to the natural world, you see. Now, the theists among them, like Locke, Descartes earlier, see God's purpose is involved in the way in which the mechanisms of nature work. But if all you've got is the mechanisms of nature, you have a world devoid of any moral significance in and of itself. You see. And I think it follows that if that's the case, the only way in which values arise is because of their instrumental worth as a means to something else, hence the utilitarian. As a means to some end that you assert, postulate, but you've still got the question of how do you get the ought, what you ought to do, the ought out of the is, that there is moral obligation. Now, it's in regards to then the source of moral obligation as well as moral knowledge, knowledge of what is good, that he has to appeal to sentiment. You see. So while reason does contribute indeed in those matters, and particularly in terms of knowing something about the usefulness of alternatives, utility, it's the sentiment that he has to turn in order to get at any kind of moral obligation. And you recall there the picture that we were talking about. What kinds of sentiments or feelings? Well, initially the appeal is to benevolence, a universal, natural feeling of benevolence, literally wanting what is good for others. This in contrast to the sheer egoism of somebody like Hobbes. There's a natural benevolence. Why natural benevolence? How does he explain that? What's the psychology of benevolence? Well, it involves feelings of pleasure or pain about what is happening to other people, which we describe in talking of the sentiment of sympathy. Sympathy which we feel because of the factual similarity that's empirically observable between us and other people who are going through tough times. So that underlying the sympathy, there is a significant dose of self-interest. So that even though benevolence is not by itself reducible to self-interest, it's related to self-interest. There's some combination of egoism and altruism. Now, these are all feelings, moral sentiments, impressions of reflection, if you like. And it's out of this that there arises then the sense of ought, so that the ought means simply that I feel I ought, I want them to have good, and so forth. And underlying this, that tinge of self-interest related to it. So that, in a nutshell, is Hume's ethic. And so the rules that amount to justice, you see, arising from that, justice is utilitarian in its intent. He calls those rules laws of nature. But the laws of nature are the sort of thing which we want for utility's sake in this context. Well, let me pause there for your reaction to this that we were doing last Friday. Yeah.
Where does he get the ought? Does he feel like it
yeah.
be there just because of ethics? Or?
Yes. After all, any ethic is more than a description of what in fact people do. That's not ethics. That's sociology. You see. No, if you want to talk about ethics, you're talking of something that's normative. You see, what ought I to do? What is the good that I should pursue? Why be good? Why do good? That's the question, you see. Age-old question. And Hume's response is that we have an inner compulsion to do so. So in that sense, the ought is self-imposed, whereas for Hobbes, in the Leviathan situation, in the long run, it turns out, while it originates in sort of a self-imposed contract, it turns out to be socially imposed by the Leviathan. In divine command ethics, where the ought is the will of God, divinely given. But in Hume, with his ethical subjectivism, it's kind of self-imposed thing. But don't jump to the conclusion from that he's an ethical relativist. No, because the universal sameness of psychology is that the same kind of benevolence is characteristic in different degrees of all human beings. You see? So he's trying to find a basis for morality, for moral obligation that is universally the same. And you have to look for something that's universally alike for that. And human psychology is where he looks. Yeah. David.
Does the feeling of sympathy necessarily arise just because the pleasure and pain in someone else's? Aren't there some people in our society that pleasure comes seeing other people in pain?
Well, there you see, if that is the case, what you say, David, that there are some people whose natural benevolence is completely altruistic, unrelated to their own pleasure and pain, you see, then you've got a difference of fact about human psychology. How would you argue yours? How would you argue his? Well, the same juncture, and we'll saying a little bit more about him later on. You may remember from your intro course, you may, Dave, I don't know if the others read the same piece in theirs, but Joseph Butler has a classic response to ethical egoism, or rather to psychological egoism, the view that everybody pursues their own self-interest above all. You see. His response is not that there are some human actions that are totally disregarding of self. No. His response is that they may have reference to the self, but the primary concern in such actions is not that self-interest, but the object that one is after. You see. It's not self-absorbed. Egoism says self-absorbed. No, but even Butler, the principal opponent of egoism in that context, doesn't say not even self-referential. No, he allows that. No, and I guess, I think if you can allow that, it defuses the situation, because the egoist's response is going to say, well, don't you get some degree of satisfaction out of seeing other people getting along nicely when you've had a hand in it? You see? Yeah, you do. It's much more